Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the Rainbow Six Siege open beta. This is actually more of an update video to my thoughts on the closed beta, because I'm really only going to go over the differences between the two. Now, I've played this open beta actually longer than I played the closed beta, so I have more thoughts on this than I do on the closed beta. But there's a lot of bleed over between the two, so I'm really only going to focus on the major differences here. The first thing you would notice if you'd played the closed beta is that open beta is obviously much more polished. I mean, the game is coming out on December 1st, right now anyway. They may delay it, they may not. Probably won't at this point. But suffice to say, it is considerably more polished. It looks better for the most part, although I did run into a few weird graphics glitches here and there. And I did run into issues with the blood splatters on the walls and such. For some bizarre reason, they decided to go with basically neon red for the blood in this thing now. And it looks horrible. Now, I don't know whether it's just a mess up with the renderer or whatever, but it looks horrible. It looks like basically you're going through paintball or something like that. So it looks completely and utterly ridiculous, not at all realistic. That's the only noticeable difference, really. They did make a few other slight changes, but you barely notice them, if at all. And they cleaned up the interface somewhat, although it is still a bit confusing to navigate sometimes, so they probably should work on that. Namely, they introduced the shop menu and all that, and that's in the top left corner of the screen now, when the options menu is in the top right corner of the screen. It's weird. I don't know why they did it that way, but it functions is about all I can say for it. It takes a lot of getting used to, and even with the several hours I ended up putting into the beta, I still never really got used to it. So they probably should have stuck with the KISS principle on that, and if you don't know what that means, it's keep it simple, stupid. I mean, let's face it, a menu should be functional first and then stylish second, and they went with more style than substance, but it is still mostly functional, so it kind of works out in the end. It just takes a lot of getting used to, and they really could have handled it better. But when you go over to sound design, it's pretty much exactly the same as it was during closed beta. They resolved a few things here and there, and they polished it up a bit, but generally speaking, it's the same kind of stuff you saw in closed beta, so nothing really to talk about there. But the big changes came in the gameplay department. They did introduce a few new operators as well as a new map. The new map is the Canal, and it's a sort of industrial, naval-based kind of thing. They also brought back the Hereford and House maps that were in the closed beta, and I believe they were also in the earlier versions of the game as well. And the new operators they introduced were the other Spetsnaz operatives. So you got Tachanka, Kapkan, and Glaz. And Glaz is, as far as we can tell, the only sniper in the entire game. So that's pretty interesting, and they also introduced Tachanka, who is the only one with a mountable machine gun, and Kapkan, who puts booby traps on various doors and windows and such. And so they mixed those in with some characters that we already saw in earlier versions of the game, although they did remove a few of the ones that we saw in the closed beta. For example, they got rid of Sledge, Smoke, Fuse, Twitch, and Rook, and Jaeger, and they brought back pretty much everybody else, so you did have a pretty wide array of operatives to choose from. Although the new operatives are kind of weird to throw into the balance. I mean, Kapkan seemed pretty balanced for the most part, other than just being heavily armored. Maybe he should be reduced down to medium armor, but other than that, he's not really that bad. And if anything, his ability is actually kind of useless because people just destroy the booby traps before you can actually run into them, and only the newest of players are going to run into those things, so he's actually kind of worthless overall, other than just having a pretty decent array of weaponry to choose from. Tachanka was pretty useful if you could get him into a good position to actually oversee an area without exposing himself too much. Because if you can get to the sides or behind him, he's just a sitting duck. But other than that, he's a lot like Kapkan in that he has a lot of armor and he's pretty slow. He has a decent array of primary weapons to choose from apart from his stationary LMG. But he ultimately ended up being extremely situational simply because of the fact that it's so easy to get around him when he's on the machine gun. And then there's Glaz. Glaz can either be absolutely terrible or ridiculously overpowered depending on who is using him. If the person using them is anything remotely resembling a decent shot, then he's ridiculously overpowered because his gun is basically a 1 or 2 shot kill. Period. End of story. he is the only sniper in the entire game, and he has a semi-automatic sniper rifle. It's really a DMR more than anything else, but suffice to say, high recoil on his semi-automatic rifle isn't really enough to balance him out, simply because that rifle just does so much damage compared to every single other weapon in the entire game. The only thing that really compares is if you get a headshot with something, or if you are point blank with a shotgun, in which case it will just completely and utterly shred whoever you're shooting at with it. But this guy is good at pretty much any range, so they do need to do something to try to balance him out, but I don't know what exactly they would do to be able to do that. I guess you could make him ridiculously squishy to the point where he can't take much of any damage at all, but then I'm sure a lot of people would complain about that and not ever use him. But here's the thing, he doesn't really come in all that well to begin with, simply because the game is so focused on CQB. There's not really all that much call for a marksman role, and so I see why there's only one of them in the game so far, but he's not really all that useful with the maps we've been given. He's useful in the house map because he can take up a position outside the house and then shoot through the windows, but other than that, there's not really much opportunity to take full advantage of him, and people just end up using him as a CQB operative with a ridiculously powerful rifle, and that's pretty much it. They just have to watch their shots, which admittedly isn't that hard in this game, so that is something to keep in mind. Now, they did do some tweaks to the existing classes as well, and they threw in a few classes that we didn't get to mess with during the closed beta. For example, Castle is an operative that has reinforced barricades, so when you go up to barricade a wall or a window or something like that, he can put up a sort of bulletproof barricade that will resist a hell of a lot more damage than a normal barricade would. So he's pretty useful, but he's really more useful in the sense of just trying to funnel your enemies into a certain area instead of just throwing up defenses and figuring out things as you go. Now, they did also throw in Thatcher, who throws EMP grenades, as well as Ash, who has a breaching grenade launcher, which is actually really powerful if you think about it, because you can breach into a room without actually being anywhere near the charge, and then you can use that as a distraction or something like that. So it's a really useful class. The way they balance that out is by making her have light armor, so she can't really take much of a beating, and what you end up doing is using her in more of a support role. And for the most part, the classes that return that we've actually seen before in the closed beta are pretty much exactly as they were. They might have had some slight tweaks. For example, Pulse had a few tweaks with regards to the heartbeat sensor just looking slightly different and having a better presentation overall. IQ had her range for the electronics detector increased, so it actually is much more useful than it used to be. Bandit had increased damage to his shock devices, and so on and so forth. They also threw in a lot of tweaks with regards to things like the attachments for weapons, so grips and laser sights had their accuracy bonuses reduced pretty considerably, and they drastically reduced the accuracy of hip fire while using a shield, which is greatly appreciated, and it really does help to balance out the shield classes, because they were ridiculously overpowered during closed beta. And now in the open beta, more often than not, you actually don't see all that many people using them, and it's simply because they take more of a support role now. There really are just walking shields, or in the case of Blitz, a walking shield and flashbang, basically. So they are much more useful in that role than they are in just waltzing right into the enemy's defenses and just completely and utterly annihilating them like they did in the closed beta. It is a greatly appreciated thing, and it is really nice to see them actually doing something about something that was blatantly overpowered during closed beta. So anything that is messed up in terms of balance right now is likely to get patched up by day one, so that is well appreciated, and it's nice to see them actually working on attaining a strong game balance. And they even extended it over to the T-Hunt mode, where if you guys played the closed beta, then you know that the suicide units would come in and they would just completely and utterly wreck you. Now you actually have damage dispersal over distance, so they don't just do full damage at whatever range the explosion happens. Now they do full damage at the epicenter, and then as it spreads out, the damage gets reduced further and further until eventually it basically does nothing. So that is greatly appreciated. I don't know why they didn't have it in the closed beta. So even though these guys are still incredibly infuriating, they're not quite as ridiculously infuriating as they were during closed beta, because now you can actually sometimes at least escape them. But generally speaking, once they show up, you're dead. So hard and realistic modes during that mode are still pretty ridiculous, and it's just gets insane sometimes. But that said, the main problem with this thing is not in the gameplay department. Most of the gameplay is pretty solid, in fact. The main problem they have with it is in their server architecture and the matchmaking. Still. I mean, to give you an idea, we closed beta players got early access to the open beta. We got it on the 24th instead of the 25th, like most people were supposed to get it on. And because we were having so many problems with the matchmaking, just straight up not working on the 24th, they ended up postponing the opening of the beta basically a day. And they finally did sort out a few of the matchmaking issues, but by and large, it's still a complete mess. It doesn't work properly, and they really need to overhaul the whole system. And on top of that, when you finally get into a game, sometimes the hit registration is really wonky, and it seems like the servers are at a really low tick rate. I think with regards to the tick rate, I was looking around on the subreddit for it, and I saw a thread where the players had basically deduced that the tick rate was 15 for the servers. Now, to give you a comparison, at its absolute lowest, the Battlefield games were 30 tick rate. And we all know how ridiculous the hit registration was in those, to the point where you would constantly just kill each other. And that actually did happen numerous times throughout my time with the open beta. So if they're wanting this thing to be an actual competitive game, the likes of, say, Counter-Strike, then they really need to sort out the tick rate on the servers, because that is just absolutely destroying the netcode and basically making it, the hit registration, ridiculous. To say nothing of the way the actual connections are done, because during the open beta I did run into numerous instances where the game would just get in an infinite load segment during the connection phase, and I couldn't get out of it without just exiting the game. And then I go back in only to find that I've been locked out of ranked matchmaking for 15 minutes because I apparently abandoned a game in progress, even though we weren't actually playing the game. We were sitting there on a load screen with nothing actually happening for a good 10 minutes or so. So they definitely need to sort that kind of crap out. And that's ultimately what's going to be making or breaking this thing when the game does launch in a couple of days. If they still don't have these matchmaking problems sorted out, and if they still don't have the connection issues sorted out and such like that by the time the game launches, this thing will pretty much be dead on arrival, and we really don't want that, because the game itself is not bad. It's actually fairly decent, at least from what I've played so far. It may have limited long-lasting appeal because of the smaller maps and lack of any real single-player options, but generally speaking, if they're going for a competitive FPS, they need the matchmaking to work, and they need their tick rate to be solid. They need their netcode to be solid. And right now, those are the two big things that are bringing it down. They need to fix the matchmaking, they need to fix the netcode, the tick rate, whatever the case is that is causing these hit registration problems and causing these lag issues that people are having. Balancing issues can be fixed after the fact. This is a matter of fundamental issues that need to be fixed. The game needs to be technically functional on launch, otherwise it's just dead in the water. Anyway, that was the open beta for Rainbow Six Siege. I will be picking up the full game eventually. I don't know when, but I will be picking it up eventually and doing a full review of it. But until then, let's just say I am rather concerned for where this series is going and where this game is going, considering how many issues there have been with it. I mean, the matchmaking issues have been going on at least since closed beta, probably since before that. So the fact that they haven't fixed those makes me really worried for the game's release. Thanks for watching.